Hola, c'est cool. Philosophy to get up to. Good morning, welcome everyone. Welcome to Maui Gulu, Tantujuia Olives, It's best when everyone is included. That's what that translates to. My name is Tex Marshall. I'm from Eskasoni, Wadebexiguina, a member of the Bear Clan. My great-grandfather, Grand Chief Gabriel Silverwood, Wegoma was his hometown. This is where he was from. So driving here this morning, beautiful sunrise, and the lake was so calm and peaceful, couldn't help but be thinking about my great-grandfather and the many years he lived in practicing his knowledge and teachings. So once again, Jilazotik, welcome here today. The custom for us as Ongu, as Big One, when we come together, we ensure that we start in a good way, and we have an opening prayer. So I'd like to call upon Captain Senti Noyom, Philip Prosper, to do an opening prayer.
So I had a lot of dry smudge. I'm just using dry smudge, but anyway, now we're using that. This won't get a meeting, okay. Creator, we are meeting today to conduct matters of education, guide our hearts and minds in the spirit of fairness, right thought and speech, impart your supreme wisdom upon our thoughts, our words, and our activities, so that our affairs may reach a successful conclusion. Walali for your source of guidance. Mr. Mayor? Okay, Walali.
Microphone way back down. Claudia Phillips. As we move forward in the spirit of our ancestors, we're very fortunate today that we have Kina'matnewey drum group, White Bear, who is going to do for us, I believe, first the honor song. So please rise, remove your headgear. You can. In honor of Ongu, Big honor song. Take it away, White Bear.
Okay, push it.
Come on.
Everyone can be seated. We're going to have one more song. These guys are so good, we're going to ask them to do one more song. We're going to do the gathering song. This group was formed right here in this school. There's powerful medicine in the power of the drum. So much so that this group has inspired a group of younger kids in the school to form another drum group. So the legacy lives on. Fantastic job. Way to go. Blah, blah, blah. So like I said, very pleased and honored to stand here as your MC for today. But but I would ask that you please be gentle on me. I only have one leg. I'm going to use it as long as I can. So a big part of our being, ways of knowing and being as Ulu, as Big Mom, is audible, storytelling. So without boring you too much, I want to tell you a little story. This story is about 3 boys and their dads. Some of you might be surprised to know that Jamie White, who's a teacher at Wampu, has a son. It's true, it's true. The other dad I'm referring to is phys ed teacher here at Wampu, Blair Hervey. Mr. Hervey's son. The third one is about Tex Marshall's son. So anyway, these boys were talking about their dads. So Jimmy White's son said, "You know what, my dad is amazing." "How's that?" they said. "Well, he got a chance to go to an NBA game in Toronto with the Raptors. And they drew his name at halftime for the contest of making a basket from half court. So Jamie's son said, well, he didn't take the shot from half court, he decided to take it from full court. So Jamie White took a basketball shot, full court, at the Scotiabank Center in Toronto, and swoosh, made the basket. And he said, you know what else? He donated his prize money to charity. Well, Blair Hervey's son said, hey, that ain't nothing. My dad's amazing. He got a chance to go to the Montreal Canadiens game, the Bell Center in Montreal. And he was picked for the Scoro contest between the second and third period. So Blair Hervey stood at center ice at the Bell Center, was going to take a shot on a little opening to win a prize. And he jumped around and made a shot backhanded and scored on the scoreboard. And he said, and you know what else? Blair Hervey donated his prize money to the land claim pool money. That's how amazing he is. So Tex Marshall's son said, that ain't nothing. My dad is simply amazing. So amazing, I would not be surprised if he could leap tall buildings in a single bound. But he said, you know what? You know how amazing my dad is? He works at MK. He works every day from 9 to 5, but he's home at 3. Please be gentle and kind to me. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a warm welcome from our host community, host school, Kina'matnewey, Education Director, Eleanor Bernard.
Well, that's what we need. Chidira, I just to the make go expo. Dana, Begisi doom, after how I elman, abon one, when. Mau make it a movie, downing, abon a movie, na Kinijan. So, just to say hello. Thank you for the introduction, Tex. And I want to welcome everyone here. Very warm welcome to our community. And I also want to just reiterate that we want you to share with us your knowledge. And of course, whatever knowledge you gain from here, you take it back to your community. And of course, the beneficiaries are the students, that they will benefit and that they will take whatever they've learned on into the future immediately. So just want to say how amazing the staff here is at Wegoma, and they really worked hard to get this set up this morning and last night. So they really worked hard, and of course we really appreciate them. we always work here as a team. So everyone helped out. Walalio, Pasiki Walalio. And I also want to thank MK for bringing this networking day here in Wegoma. So without further ado and any more delay, let's get rolling.
A few more delays, sorry. We're running on indigenous time, so we'll do our best to try to get back on colonial time. So I just want to mention a few items before we move on to our next. Oh, I want to acknowledge our fearless leader at MK, our Executive Director, Blair Gould. She's supposed to be speaking, but she's graciously offered to move the schedule along a little quicker, so she's going to sit this one out. But I want to acknowledge Blair as our amazing leader. It's a lot of fun to work for Blair, so just acknowledgement to her, Claudia. So in our day of inclusion, we are when I want to acknowledge someone today that's part of our Special Olympians group that has competed in Special Olympics with us at Summer Games and our MK track meet over the years. A gentleman by the name of Bison. And Bison today has a snack shack just down the hall that's selling snacks, some tasty items and some healthy items. Also, I think he has fruit cups. There's a whole list of items that he's selling. So we need you to support Bison Snack Shack today. So the challenge today and the goal is that we sell out Bison. So reach out, reach down into your pockets, grab that money, and let's sell out Bison today, the Bison Snack Shack. I just want to acknowledge your lanyards that you have for your name tags. Those lanyards were handmade by our friends at Maui Dock. Maui Dock is a special place here in Wegoma. And Rose and her crew, they work tirelessly and very hard to provide those lanyards for today. They're very special. Do not toss them. Keep them. We also have what we just titled, Amber and Doreen, a few days ago, medicine bags. So there's items in here that are sensory items for regulating. We have the Tango Fidget for busy hands, and we also have the calming strips. These were created by a person known as Michael Malkin, who has anxiety, and he created these strips, the stickers. The idea came from using painter's tape. So make sure you utilize those and check the availability, and they'd be wonderful in your classrooms for regulating those who are suffering from anxiety and other challenges. So ensure that they are items that can help you become grounded and calm, and place them on the desk or laptops or anywhere a person can feel them. At this point in time, moving along, I'd like to call upon Janine Marshall to introduce our keynote speaker. Just like what you love.
Good morning, everyone. For those that don't know me, I'm Janine Marshall. I'm the Director of Academic Services at MK, and I'm so honored that you are all here today to take in this day of planting seeds and making inclusive spaces for all of our learners. I'm very proud of our family of schools and what you continue to accomplish with tremendous odds against you. So it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. For those that don't know me, I'm a mom of a very unique young man who has defined my life work, keeps us on our toes. Yesterday was Halloween, today it's Christmas. And he amply reminded us of that this morning, very early in his best Santa ho ho ho. So I feel it's safe to share that story because our keynote speaker is also someone who lives and walks this world of inclusion, both in her professional life and her personal life. Lois Landry is a recently retired educator who has served the Straight Board as a psychologist, a teacher, a guidance counselor, an administrator, and most importantly, a mom. Lois has always believed in the importance of her community schooling and considers herself fortunate to have spent the most of her share in her career working in schools where she grew up in. Lois has one son, Frankie, who was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2 and epilepsy as a teen. Her commitment to advocacy with persons with disability predates her son's arrival, but her passion for supporting those who are vulnerable became even more pronounced after Frankie was born. A passionate advocate for supporting school-aged children, Lois has spent the last several years working with the Art Board at Large Cape Breton and more recently with the Hearts of Almaden Disability Society. As an implementation of human rights remedy unfolds, Lois finds herself interested in the intersection between disability rights and housing. She looks forward to contributing to the important work of this organization, and she has recently completed a stint as special advisor to the Minister of Community Service. It is my pleasure to welcome fellow colleague, fellow mom, Lois Landry.
So I'm just going to make sure both mics work. We good? Great. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for that. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. I want to say a special thank you to Doreen Stevens and her team for inviting me. But in addition, I've been to a lot of in-services, and I've presented to several as well. But I've seen the lineup today, and I can say it's one of the best I've seen ever. So kudos to Doreen and her team. And I am feeling a little bit like the weakest link in this presentation, but we will do what we can. So thank you very much for having me. I'm kind of tethered to this podium because we're also live streaming, which is new to me. So we'll move right along and see how we go. So, no. There we go. Great. So I do want to introduce myself, and I'll expand a little bit on the introduction. So yes, my name is Lois Landry. When I grew up in Almaden, and I continue to live, I live a stone's throw from where I was born. And my work, when I first went to university, I came out as a psychologist, and my first job, I was in Amherst for a while, but I moved back home and I worked with the Inverness District School Board, so I used to circuit all the schools. But eventually, I come from a very long line of teachers, so I moved back into classroom, and so I've taught from grade 3 up to grade 11, and can I just say, to plan an in-service the day after Halloween, smart. You should do that. We should all do that every year. Good on you. And so I eventually moved around. I like change. I like to grow. And so I moved into guidance because I had the background in psychology. And then I got into administration. And so what I will say is that all of that is colored by the fact that I am the mother of Frankie. So what I learned very early on is that I was riding, as I took Frankie through the school system, from primary up to grade 12 and up to the age of 21, I was riding on the coattails of people who fought fights before me. So just the right to be in a school with his same age peers, just the right to be on a school bus. There were people before me who fought that fight. And so I didn't have those arguments with staff. So because I recognize the people who went before me, I take very seriously the idea that it is my responsibility to kind of keep that torch going and to make life for people behind Frankie better. Frankie, as was just mentioned, Frankie is autistic. He was diagnosed at the age of 2. He doesn't speak, but he's as funny as anything. And so we'll speak a little bit about Frankie as I go on. Frankie doesn't speak. He's very wonderfully childlike. I got married last year, and this is Frankie and I dancing at my wedding. And we're dancing to Oscar the Grouch, I Love Trash. So sometimes inclusion is about finding ways for, and everybody at the hall knew all the words to all the songs. So sometimes inclusion is about finding ways for the context to fit the kids. And so I take my advocacy really seriously. I will say that Frankie is also epileptic, and autism's got its challenging moments, but epilepsy's just gross. So my heart goes out to people who face medical challenges in addition to some of the other things. What I always start every presentation off with, though, is I feel it's important for me to acknowledge that I come, and I have come, into every single job role I have ever had from a really important, significant place of privilege. And I recognize that not everybody brings that to the table. So as I tell stories, I try to preface it with this, because if you were to say, yeah, easy for you to say, that is absolutely fair. Both my parents went to university. We had lots of food to eat in the house. We had lots of opportunity. I always made, I worked all along. I had financial advantages that other people don't have. And I have a brother who has a learning disability, and it's a totally different story watching him and I. It used to be a totally different story watching him and I get on the school bus. I was skipping because I love school. I was going to have a great day. And Paul just hated every minute of every day in school. So I recognize that being hardwired to do well in school when you spend 5 hours a day in school is something not everybody gets the opportunity. And I acknowledge that being white is something that is tremendously impactful. And it is through the lifespan, but I will tell you that it continued throughout my career and continues today to sometimes stumble upon yet another reason why being white makes life so much easier, and the challenges that come before Indigenous students. So as an example of that, when you turn 19, if you have a significant disability, the expectation is that your parents aren't required to support you, that you're an adult. And so the provincial government has a program, the Disability Support Program, for 19-year-olds. And it's meant to acknowledge that we support our vulnerable. So when kids would turn 19, I could call them into my office and say, all right, let's just get this ball rolling, and here's the phone number you call. And within a month, there would be money in their accounts for those folks to support their kids. And if I said that same thing to a Mi'kmaq family from Budladek, it would be nothing but run around. You call this number. Oh, no, I'm sorry, you don't call this number. You actually have to call this number. No, you don't call this number, you call that number. And I feel like there are systemic barriers, and one of them is systemic conveniences. So you make things so complicated that people just figure it's easier to just give that up. So I think we are still uncovering lots of opportunities to see where Indigenous people are struggling with the system we have put in front of them. And so we're going to speak a little bit more about that as it relates to the human rights remedy. The other, just to keep it on a cheery note, the other is definitely what I would consider to be a crisis in education. So anybody here who's a little longer in the tooth and has been around for a while will tell you that the education system that we started working in, whether you've been working for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, it is not the same system that you were in yesterday. And it is not the same system that you will go back to Monday morning. So there are several challenges, and not the least of which is a teacher shortage. So, I mean, I was a vice principal not many years ago, maybe 10, 15, well, I guess 15 years ago. And I remember having to go to meetings with substitutes who were mad because they weren't getting enough sub days to even qualify for, benefits. So now here we are. If you have a pulse, they'll drag you off the street into some of the schools in our neck of the woods. So gone are the days where I remember first time I did job interviews, it was a grade 3 position, we had 85 applicants. Those days are gone. And not only are those days gone, but the days of having enough teachers, enough substitutes, but also the support staff that we need to rely on even more as the years go on, that support staff, we are struggling to fill those positions. And so it is really a challenging time. And what I as a principal kind of realized is every time I went into the staff room, people just stopped making eye contact with me because they knew I was going to ask them to do one more thing. So nobody would look, don't look at her and maybe she won't ask you. So I think there are more and more demands being placed on teachers, and our classroom profiles are definitely changing. Who is coming to school is changing. There's research on the impact that COVID had on some of our kids and the anxiety that they have, that they're still kind of coming out of that. So there's lots for us to be concerned about. So that's the dreary news. But I guess what I'm hoping to do today is to present a little bit of a vision about what inclusive education can mean. And so if we start with a vision of what inclusivity means and what it means to be inclusive in schools, then hopefully we can all kind of move ourselves in the same direction. And I'd like for us to think about, even if you're not an elementary teacher, you can probably relate to this, but imagine you have your first day of school, you're the teacher in a grade 3 classroom. And you know that if you ask every student in that classroom to read to you, you know that some aren't going to know their letters and some are going to read all the books, So the range of what you see in your classrooms is really vast and varied. It's the same when you do an in-service on inclusive education. It has been my experience. There are some people that are really comfortable with having all the learners and all the diversities, and they're relishing the opportunity. And there are some people who are really, we haven't moved as far along. And individual people, even within the same school, have different feelings about how comfortable they are and how much they know or think they know about inclusive education. So my goal today, and I think it would be a misstep for any of us to say, we need to get everybody up to snuff really quickly. I think this is a journey, and we want to see folks feel more comfortable to ask questions and learn from each other. It's been my experience that there are probably a lot of people in this room who have a lot of good things to share, who often don't feel comfortable doing that because they maybe don't feel like that makes them an expert enough. But there is lots of knowledge, and so I think if we kind of figure out where we're hoping to be, then we all get to move on that journey. So to that end, what does inclusive classroom look like? So that's what I'm going to spend the first maybe half of this kind of presentation talking about, is what inclusive classrooms can look like in your school. We'll take that through the lifespan a little bit, through the grades. I do want to shift gears maybe once we get halfway through. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what happens when kids leave school, so when they age out of the school system. And for those folks saying, gosh, I teach grade 2, that doesn't really impact me, I really think it does. I think it helps if we know where we're going. And so I'm hoping that we all, no matter what grade, what position we hold, I'm hoping that we all see ourselves and our place in this as a complete and total journey. So when I talk about inclusive education, I'll just preface that a little bit. I can't speak to MK, but I will say in the provincial system, inclusive education used to mean what we used to think of as special education. And so that's really what I'm speaking to you about. Inclusive education, though, has really expanded in the provincial system to include cultural pedagogy, anti-Black racism, treaty education. All of those things are critically important. One of my concerns with that broadening is that when the government says, and again I'm talking about the provincial system, but when the government says, we have invested $100 million in inclusive education, because they've changed what it means to be inclusive, I'm not sure very much of that actually went to special education. So I'm not sure we see a whole lot more TAs. I'm not sure we see a whole lot. I get that we have CYCPs that are doing emotional regulation with our whole classrooms, but I wouldn't consider that traditional special education. So what I'm speaking about here today, I guess when I'm talking about inclusion, I really am talking about that what we used to call special education. So for our children who are disabled, particularly those who are intellectually disabled. And I want to start with just a little history of why I think so many of us are at a different place on the continuum. So I used to do a lot of circuit work when I was a psychologist, and I would go from Canso to Shedicamp. I used to work in Amherst. And I wondered at the beginning of my career, as some of these transitions were happening, I wondered how did we get to the place where so many people thought so many different things about inclusion. And I think it's because of what I consider this pendulum of inclusion. So for those of you who are my age, I'm 56, I'm sure many of you, if you're that age, or if you go home and speak to some of your older folks, your elders, there was a time when special education happened sometimes in a different building, in a different community, and if it did happen in your building, it was on a different floor. It was very, very separate. So if you were deaf or hard of hearing, you went to Amherst. I have a really close friend who has a sister who was deaf, and I never met her. I never met her. She moved to Amherst very, very early on in her little life. And so there was a time where what we did was we segregated folks. So in my class, the kids that lived 2 miles from me did not get on the bus with me, who had intellectual disabilities. They didn't go to the same school with me up until grade 7, and when I went to the same school that they were at, they were in the basement. They actually had a different entrance. So there were some things that we did that were, by today's standards, just gross. Like it was really challenging. And I would like to think that people said, gosh, that's just wrong. We should stop doing that. In fact, it's always court orders, right? It's a human rights issue. Somebody took somebody to court, and so they said you can't do that anymore. But then the pendulum swung, in my opinion, really too far the other way. So anybody who kind of came around at that time, I remember sitting in a classroom in Canso. I was a psychologist and I was doing circuit work, and there was this little boy with Down syndrome, cute as a button, in grade 3, really challenged with speaking and just a sweet. And he's sitting there with a grade 3 math sheet, the exact same sheet that everybody else in the class has. And he has absolutely no way to even begin to look at this. And I said to the teacher, is there maybe some other things we could try? She said, no, I'm not allowed, I have to treat them all the same. So I think we saw that pendulum shift from they belong somewhere else to, oh, government says they all have to be treated the same. And so the pendulum has moved, but I think that's why we have these challenges around what does that mean? So that's where inclusivity has come from. So, this is maybe not everybody's definition of inclusion, but to me, inclusive education or inclusion is about including children with disabilities in ways that are meaningful, and at the same time helping to make all of our settings accessible. So, sometimes we change the activity, sometimes we change the settings, sometimes we provide kids with what's in their best interest. So that's a little bit about where I'm sort of framing this. And one other thing I like to say is, I remember being in a job interview. I was interviewing staff. And we were talking about, somebody had done a reference check for a teacher, a young teacher, and I remember there was some conversation about, you know, she's not really open to having kids with special needs in her class. And I knew the teacher, and I remember thinking at that moment that sometimes when people are reluctant, when they express reluctance, or if you just feel it from the vibe, so they don't seem like they're open to what you're selling in terms of including kids, I have always believed that that comes from a place of fear. There's nothing worse that you could say to a mother than you're a bad mother, right? That there's no worse insult. And if you're a teacher, there is no worse insult than you're not doing right by my kid. And so I believe that when teachers express a reluctance or a fearfulness or a, oh, I don't know, does that really should happen here? Is there a special ed teacher somewhere? I believe that that comes from the place of, what if I don't do right by the children who are in front of me? And I think when we allow ourselves to understand that that fearfulness is really something we shouldn't make people feel bad for. So I will tell you the extent, so my son needs visuals. I'll speak to you about some of the visuals, but he had a teacher in grade 6. So Frankie would have, I don't know if you've seen First Then. So first you do your work and then you get some kind of treat to entice kids to stay on task. So Frankie used to do First Then, and there was Velcro, and he was in a grade 6 class. And the teacher asked for him to be removed from the class, not just that day, but forever, because when he took the card off the first and put it in the then bucket, the sound of the Velcro ripping was distracting to the other students, and so he had to leave. Now, I'm sorry, I was the principal. I was my son's principal. So this is a teacher on my staff who nobody told me, so I didn't hear about this until months later. I knew this teacher to truly be a teacher who cared about kids. And I really, I'm not gonna lie, I had to dig deep this sort, but for the most part, where that came from, even though it was egregious, where that came from was a deep sense of fearfulness that she was not going to do right by Frankie, that she was not good enough to teach Frankie, she didn't know enough about autistic kids, and so that came from a place of fearfulness. And when we call them YSF, or special ed teachers, when those teachers talked to her about, no, actually, here's the advantages to Frankie doing this here, you can get your kids to work with Frankie, that kind of thing, then that sort of started to grow, and she became one of the teachers who was actually Frankie's biggest advocates as time went on. But I recognize that sometimes the fearfulness that comes from talking about inclusion is really a deep sense of feeling like, I'm guessing lots of people who did BEDs, for example, most BEDs for a long time didn't include anything even remotely relevant to how to work with kids with special needs in classrooms, and particularly today's classrooms. So I'm always very mindful of that. And so what's the antidote to that? How do we inoculate ourselves from that? And this is, you think back in your life to some of the lessons you learned. This is absolutely one of the lessons. It was a boy who was a few years ahead of my son in age, and he was a big strapping kid, and he used to do some kind of stimming. And one day, the TA that was working with him got sort of positioned in the wrong place. It wasn't an act of aggression, he was just doing his thing. And she was this tall, and he was this tall, and he hit her in the face, and her glasses pushed up against her face, and she had a cut here, and there was bruise, and her glasses were all, it was, so of course, we called the boy's mom, and she was devastated because she just loved this TA, and so sitting across the table from the TA, Frankie was little, so I was really sensitive to this kind of stuff, and I said to her, I said, like, Helen, how do you do it every day? And she said, I just try to treat them like I would if he was my own. And so, but for the grace of God, when we talk about every single student in the classes that we're a little bit concerned about how we do right by them, but for the grace of God goes your first child, your first grandchild, your first niece, your first nephew. And so when I would speak to teachers, when I would speak to staff, I would say, what would you want to do if he was yours? And that's what I would always say, you know, if I was the principal and I was disciplining somebody or I was calling home, I'd say, listen, I'm calling you because if he was my mother, I'd want someone to call me, and I'd want somebody to tell me this. And so this is one of the ways that I think if we look at all the students that we find the most challenging, but for the grace of God goes your first something. And so how do we then think about kids in that context? So what we're going to shift gears a little, my intro. Just keeping an eye on time. So what I want to switch gears a little bit is talk about what I say, but I'm no smarter than anybody else. What I'm going to argue is ways to look at inclusive classrooms, and what do they look like, and going up through the grade levels, and what options might be available for you and your class, and how you think about what could be, and how do you inch your way toward that. So including students or making classrooms more inclusive, that looks crazy different in elementary than it does in high school. But I have taught elementary and high school, and everything is different. I remember when I taught high school, I had a ton of work to do at night, but I had the energy to do it. When I taught elementary, I mean, I could read Charlotte's Web before breakfast and have a month's worth of lesson plans, except that I would collapse at the end of every day on the couch because I was exhausted, right? So those are wildly, wildly different. And it's because where those kids are on the lifespan is changing. So there are some things that sometimes when we think about what an inclusive classroom looks like at those levels, it's the classrooms that look different. So of course, how we think about inclusion is going to look a little bit different. So what does that mean when I say elementary? So if we're talking about elementary classes, and I've heard the expression, right? Elementary is that time where you go from learning to read to reading to learn. So those are the ages where children from all walks of life are all learning how to adjust to school. So just the idea of being in a classroom with lots of people, that's just an adjustment for some people. Having to get up at a certain time of day, having to wait until a certain time of day where you can eat. All of those things are natural adjustments. And so parents are still, the other thing I will say is, conversations with parents of children who have disabilities in elementary are really, really emotional. They're really challenging because there are lots of parents who still believe that their kids are going to catch up. And it's a mourning process. I remember when I found out Frankie was autistic, it was the day before I was working in this public school. They had Scholastic Awards and the awards for sports. And Frankie's like, right now, he's 6-something, and my dad's phys ed teacher, a lot of phys ed teachers in my history. And I remember kind of mourning that Frankie's never getting a basketball award. He's never, that's all I knew. And so there is a lot of that in elementary school. You get that sort of, so those meetings, man, those are tough. When I was a psychologist, I had done a lot of assessments. I was the first psychologist in Inverness County. So I did a lot of assessments, and so I said, okay, let's just get these parent meetings, let's run them through every hour. I'll do one an hour, I think it was up in Marguerite. I made mothers cry every hour on the hour for a full day. It was a bad day. Don't do that, I don't recommend it. So those are really difficult conversations. There are also really huge gaps in what kids are exposed to at home, and especially as you bring them in from the pre-primary and those who have been to pre-primary or preschool and those haven't. The other thing is, in elementary, I believe that there is really an expectation, subtle, unspoken sometimes, that the aggression there is just something we should just tolerate. And sometimes it's not unspoken. So the Deputy Minister of Education for the province of Nova Scotia at a public accounts hearing where they were talking about violence occurring in classrooms said, when the number of violent incidents were reported, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, well, yes, but for most of those, the offender wasn't even 4 feet tall. So the idea that if you are bitten, somehow the fact that the child is younger than when they are older, somehow that's supposed to dismiss your concerns about the fact that you are in a workplace exposed to violence. And so there is an expectation that the aggression you're seeing is something that, oh, you're just gonna kind of swallow that and you're just move on from that. We're a little bit, we take a different approach to aggression in high school. Now, there are some real advantages though when you work in an elementary school. There is no more heartwarming scene than watching other children interact with children with special needs when they are little. My son never spoke, has never spoken. And so he uses a lot of pictures. So in the early days, he has an iPhone now, so he uses that. But in the early days, he used to have these pictures, and he would hand them to you. So milk and whatever, he had them on a card. And I remember he was at daycare, and these are really pretty, they were laminated, and they were all, really cute little pictures, all color, very bright colors. And of course, some other little kid saw these and thought they were adorable. And so picked them up and was, just wasn't doing anything bad, just playing with them. And one little girl who ended up being with Frankie throughout his school years went over and pushed the kid and said, "Hey, those are Frankie's words. He doesn't put his fingers in your mouth, so you get your hands off his words." And so there is nothing more accepting that, I would take Frankie sometimes makes noises, and I would take him to the store, and a kid in his class and the mother would be in the store, and Frankie would make some kind of yip, and the mother would kind of look, and the kid, this 5-year-old, oh no, that's just Frankie, Mom does that all the time, just move on. So there's nothing more loving than an elementary classroom. And there are, to be, I don't mean to say that this is consistent across the whole wide world, but it has been my experience. There are more services available to students in elementary school, particularly speech and language. Speech and language shifts in most places when they get to be older. And also, holy cow, many kids defy expectations. So we see some kids in primary and we think, oh, I remember my dad was a teacher and he said, if you get an N in scissors in primary, the die is cast. What are you gonna do? But it's amazing how many kids actually become things. So there's a student that Frankie used to get on the bus with, and they actually had 2 TAs. 2 kids, 2 5-year-olds, and 2 TAs because they were so concerned. And I remember after the bus driver was an old family friend, and I remember he said, "Lois, they don't need to, this is ridiculous." The other kid who needed a TA in primary is now working out west making as much as I am making. So, we can accomplish really amazing things in elementary school. So those are all good news stories. So what can inclusion look like in an elementary classroom? Well, whatever you want to call it, whether you're calling it learning center staff or special education staff, any staff that can be devoted to working with children who have disabilities, that can be really impactful. And it will look different, and it will be funded different, and there will be different amounts of it in any given classroom. But there really is a tremendous opportunity for learning center staff to be in classrooms to help students. So when I talked about mainstreaming, one of the challenges is we threw kids who had been in different places, we threw them into classrooms, but we really didn't put supports in. So anybody who thinks inclusion is cheap is in the wrong profession. Inclusion is not meant to be cheap, and it's not meant to save us from having classrooms in the basement or funding schools in Amherst. Inclusion is going to be costly. And so whatever it looks like in your school, there are really sort of 2 roles for educators who are working with our disabled kids. And one is that you can work in the classroom to help make the activities that are going on in the classroom more meaningful for the kids who are there. And I'll speak a little bit, after I get through these, I have an example of what it might look like specifically with a learning activity. So you have the opportunity to have learning staff go into the classroom and say, look, we're going to work with this child and have this child included. My son is somebody who we knew would never talk, and so a lot of what but he did all the letters and he worked with words, and so, his teacher was teaching him to follow the words so that you understand the spelling of it and the spaces, because if you want to use adaptive technology, the spaces between words is hugely important. So he was included in those kinds of activities, but he also, and this is where sometimes people say, are we allowed to do that? He also came out of class. He came out of class a lot. And he came out of class for a couple of reasons. He came out of class because it was important for him to learn that there are things he needs to learn that others don't. So I needed Frankie to learn not to dart out into the street. And so there was a whole time where Frankie would just take off. So, but now, because the school and I worked on it, if I say the word wait, he just stops and he just waits. And I am 56 and he is 23. So when we go places, he has to wait a lot for me to catch up. So that was something the rest of the class didn't need to learn that. It is okay for kids to come out to learn things. The other thing is Frankie hates being around people when they eat. He just has some sensory issues. It drives him crazy. So I would go to these meetings and they would say, we've tried this, and we've tried moving the microwaves, and can't he just go somewhere else? We don't have to torture kids because that doesn't fit what they want. Now, Frankie, and this happens quite often, researchers don't really know why, but Frankie was part of a cluster. So in a group of 30, there were, I think, 5 autistic kids in his class, and you didn't see that on either side. Researchers don't know why that happens, but we do have clusters. And so those parents who also had kids in that cluster believed different things. I was somebody who understood the trajectory of Frankie's life really, really quick. I wasn't arguing with anybody. Meanwhile, another student, his mom was determined that he stay. He was going to do long division by God no matter what. Sometimes in elementary, we have to help parents get through the process. So no, the 2 students didn't both leave to go to lunch. But Frankie hated being around people, and the idea that we were forcing him in to sit with other people didn't make a lot of sense. Make sure that they are included. And so there's lots of opportunity for that. Now, junior high is a bit of a shift, right? So junior high is the time where all students finish up their elementary years, and we do tend to see some of those gains level off. So the huge improvements that you see, you do tend to see a little bit of a leveling off of those huge gains that you would see. So what is the goal of junior high? Well, is it that everybody catches up so that they're all intellectually or academically at the same point? No, that is wasted effort in my opinion. The goal, I think, is for each adult that interacts with them to help each child become their best self. And that's what we do for all of our junior high students. So what happens in these grades? Well, in junior high, all students develop interests. So when we had grade 7s, the public school program says that once you hit grade 7, you do the electives. So tech ed, art, music, family studies. So in our school, we were big enough that we were able to offer all 4, and we would ask kids, which ones do you want? Some kids were like, put me in music, holy cow, and some kids would keep me out of music no matter what. So you start to see in junior high the kids develop their strengths and their challenges, and they start to recognize those, and they start to that's when we have, so what do you want to do after high school? Conversations, right? So someone who loves sports might start thinking, okay, I'm going to be a phys ed teacher, or I'm going to work at a fitness place. So that is a naturally occurring thing in junior high. And we start to ask, what do you want to do when you finish school? So the same applies to kids with disabilities. So Grade 7, believe it or not, is when we really start looking at transition planning. And we start to talk to kids when we can. We start to talk to their families. Like, what do you think interests you? Now, my son was somebody who was always pretty social, and he has a great sense of humor. So I saw on your presentation that you have presentation on like visuals. So my son always used visuals. There was, when he would get to school, there would be like a daily sort of visual schedule. So it would tell him, the TA, before she went home the day before, she would put so he's gonna do math, and then he would have a break, and then he would have reading, and then he would have recess, and then he would go to the gym. So it was all that, and that way, every time he finished something, he would put it in the done file, so he knew what his day looked like. One day there was a substitute TA in for him, and the teacher said, just go follow the schedule, it's already set up. So Frankie got on the bus early though, he was one of the first kids at the school. So she takes this visual schedule and she goes to all the stops on the list, and you know, she went to the really fun parts of the day, like gym. It seemed like that was first, and then the phys ed teacher, no, this is not when he's supposed to be. He's not here till later in the day. Oh, sorry. She'd go to the next really fun spot, like the library. No, he's not supposed to be here. So the TA knew she was going to be in the next day. She said, okay, well, I'm definitely making sure I've got this right. So before she left, she set the whole thing up and had his schedule just so, and she knew that something was up, because when she got to school the next day, the schedule said recess, 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 recess. So he had gone in and had changed all the cards and had put what he wanted to do. So we knew that he was very social, and we knew that he had a sense of humor. So the conversations that we would have with junior high students is we would say, you know, look, we need to talk to you about your math. You want to be a nurse? We need to make sure that, you know, you've got to concentrate on your math, that kind of thing. So we have those same kind of concentrations when we have those transition meetings with parents. So if you want to have an emotional conversation, you say to a parent of a child who has a disability, what are your greatest hopes for your child? And then ask them, what are your worst fears? That is a conversation and a half, and it is a Kleenex box conversation for sure. Because there are a lot of things that families at this point start to become really worried about. But those conversations are really what our programming needs to be directed to. So while we are fighting the good fight about reading and communicating, once kids get to be in junior high, it's really helpful to start to say, where are they going and how do we start programming for that? So an important shift at that point is for kids who, like my Frankie, we're just not going to talk. Frankie does not talk. The idea that we would force that anymore, that ship has sailed. Let's move on. And so really, come junior high, the conversations were about adaptive technology. So Frankie can come here with his iPhone and say, you know, I want a cheeseburger, and hit button and it says I want a cheeseburger. Those are the things that make him able to communicate. And so at junior high, we start to build that into our programming. So then if you continue up that way, what does that mean in high school? In high school, we really have started to ask kids, I mean, I used to do course requests with kids going into grade 10. And I would say to them, what do you want to do after high school? And they would say, if somebody said I want to be a nurse, and say, but I really don't like math, can I not take academic math? No, if you want to get into nursing, you need to have academic math. You need to pick chemistry. So as kids go through the grades in high school, our job is to make sure that we're helping them get to where they want to go. And it is no different with kids who have disabilities. So some students need to have chemistry and biology in grade 12, so we need to make sure they're taking the courses that get them there. But some kids are headed somewhere, whether it's to the Rock or the Rock is a set of day programs. So if your child is, we'll talk more about that in a minute, but what does it mean for someone who's going to the Rock? So part of our programming for our kids at my school, if they were headed to the Rock for day programming, was you are going to get on the SAT bus, and a TA is going to travel with you, and you're going to make trips back and forth to Port Hawkesbury. And then we'll do that for a week. And then next week, the TA is in the car behind the SAT bus and follows it back and forth. And then the next week, we drive ahead of the SAT bus, and we meet you there. So that is something that is helping those kids, which is really no different than what we do in the abstract, than what we do to kids without disabilities. Now, there are certain lenses that we need to make sure that we're looking through as we go through, as we program for all students. So when we talk about trauma-informed practice and recognizing intergenerational trauma and all of that, those things are no different from the regular education kids and our special education kids. So, you know, the whole idea of a deficit mindset, nobody wants to hear all the things they can't do. You know, we would never put a report card, if you're doing report card comments, yeah, sure, there's lots of things you need to say about kids in areas where they need to improve, but for every kid, we want to make sure that we're including the strengths and the challenges that they bring. So all of those also apply to kids with disabilities. So, I'm mindful of time, so I want to talk just for a second about just an example. So let's suppose you are a teacher, maybe let's say grade 4, grade 8, grade 12. So we'll look at it from 3 different angles. If you have an activity that you've planned, so you want to take a group of your kids to a land-based learning activity, not far, it's not a whole day or overnight event, but you just want to go into the community and you want to do some kind of activity with a grade, 4, 8, 12 student. Well, in grade 4, if you have a child, so like my Frankie, what would that look like? Well, I have certainly sent Frankie as the principal. I've sent Frankie and kids like him in a separate car with his TA so that if he needs to leave, he can. We've figured out what part of that he would be best served at. There are activities that he can do in the classroom leading up to that to prepare, and there are some, so long as he's safe, he can be included in a lot of those things. In junior high, if you had a student with a learning disability, there would be lots of ways to take whatever their challenges are and take them out of the equation, and land-based learning is a great example for that. We have students who in high school are, really struggling to be in school every day because of the demands. We've said to kids, do you want to go? And they say, no, we don't make them. So there are all kinds of ways to look at how you include kids, and the best conversations are to have that with their parents. So I'll move on from there because I do just want to talk about leaving school, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So life after school, this is the most common description I've heard of leaving school is really falling off the cliff, right? That's the expression people use. So we send our kids to school and they have good procedures and good policies and teachers who recognize that we're all in this, we have everybody, and then sort of things fall apart. There are very little services for students who turn 21 once they leave school. And historically, there were just plain services weren't available, and if they were, wait lists were long. So I'll give you an example. I sit on the board at L'Arche Cape Breton. There's 17 families in Inverness County wanting their kids who are now 21 to go to L'Arche to participate in the day programs. And L'Arche just doesn't have the staff. They just can't. And so we've been working with government to try to, we've put proposals in. So there are 17 kids in Inverness County alone whose kids had good programming in school and are home sitting on the couch all day, all day, all day. And even when there are services, the wait lists are long. And what is really the kicker is even if you are eligible for a program that is funded, if they run out of money, oh, sorry. And we don't do that, we don't do that anywhere else. We don't go to a school and say, oh, look, a family just moved in, oh, sorry, we're at cap, sorry. Can't have that grade 3 kid. But we would never do that. And yet for adults who have disabilities, we absolutely do. And services for Indigenous folks, as I said before, is even worse because the lack of understanding, and I believe that is systemic, is I've seen lots of instances where the government makes things hard enough that people just sort of, especially parents of people with disabilities, you're just tired all the time. So the idea that you're arguing and fighting is a real challenging. So I do want to end on a bit of a good news story, is that for those of you who don't know, there is there was a court case several years ago where some folks with disabilities said to government, okay, we've been treated badly. And to put this in perspective, there is one of the folks was not intellectually challenged, but she had significant physical disabilities. And so when her family passed away, I believe, she had no one to look after her. So she went to government and she said, you know, I'm gonna need some help here. And the help they gave her was they put her in the Nova Scotia hospital, the place for the criminally insane. That's where they put her to live for, I believe, 10 years. So there were 3 folks. That's how bad adults with disabilities have been treated in this province. And I mean, like, not that long ago. So these 3 people launched a lawsuit against government and said, you know, we have been discriminated against. And the judge said, you think? Like, of course that is blatant discrimination. There was the Disabilities Human Rights Commission said, well, yeah, sure, for them, 100% true, but guess what? Every single person in Nova Scotia is discriminated against. And the judge said, yeah, I agree, and that is systemic discrimination. And everybody went, whoa, because a court case is different than a paper where a list of recommendations or advice to government. So the government has been court-ordered to implement new policies and procedures and mega dollars for adults with disabilities. So they expect over the next 4 years that is going to run to the tune of $1 billion for students with disabilities starting at the age of 21. And it impacts schools because what they're saying is that because that's coming, they want to have that support provided to high school kids to help them access it. So they're looking at closing institutions, so the Breton Ability Centre, that is closing in the next little bit. Individualized funding, so instead of L'Arche getting money, individuals like my Frankie get money and I get to rent at L'Arche if I want on his behalf. So it is a real shift, and if you are entitled to it, you get it. It's not like they can say we ran out of money. So if you have adults who are, students in your school who are 19, 18, their life is going to be dramatically different than the folks that you've seen leave high school. And there will be option for folks to pay for services, and there will be a school leaver. Now, what does that look like? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But I do believe that there's reason to hope. And so this is a presentation I did, Doreen was at it before, and it was called The Good News Story of Frankie Curry. And so Frankie is 23, so he's still working under the old system, but I really do believe that there is an opportunity to be hopeful. So that picture that you see up there, that is my son on his graduation day. So Frankie graduated, he got all of his credits in grade 12 when he was 19, and that was in 2020. So it was the year that graduations were like the 10 minutes each, right? So Frankie had a 10-minute slot at the school where he would get his high school diploma, just like everybody had their 10-minute slot. Frankie found COVID really stressful. The only thing we could do was, we have a 4-wheeler, so I would take him for, and then I hit a deer and we flipped it, and we got, like, it was just, COVID was just gross for us. And so, so when it came time to go to his graduation, would not go, forget it, not going. So I called the school and I said, like, he just won't go, so just get on with your lives, just forget about us. And they did not forget about us. And so this is my patio, and that's Frankie and his 2 teachers and all the TAs in the school. And Frankie didn't have all those TAs in his last year, but he was in this school system since he was 5, and so you would see every one of those was his TA at some point. And if you look at the bottom of his outfit, those are his red Raptors pajamas. So that was the life that I had become accustomed to, right? Frankie was part of a family in a school that really had done great things to support him. And what was on the other side of that? Nothing. There was no room at the inn for Frankie at Rock. Thank you, need not apply. Frankie wasn't able to do the things they do at Rock, so no thank you, you're not welcome here. There was no room at the Hearts, the home in Arishat, which was a convent that my family, all the nuns in my family had gone to that convent. No room for Frankie at the inn there either. We were on a wait list for L'Arche. It was 7, 8, 9, 10 years long. And so I was also a single mother at that point, and I wasn't eligible for pension. So I called these, community services, and I said, listen, either Frankie gets some money for me to figure something out, or I have to go on income assistance. So you pick which of us is getting money, because I have no options here. And and this is one of the ways where privilege matters, so there was a lot of conversations there. But if you die and go to heaven, you will have Frankie's life. Like, there is nobody living the dream like my Frankie. So Frankie now has funding from DCS. So instead of them giving money to L'Arche or to The Rock, they give it to me to pay for somebody to work with Frankie. And so on Mondays, he goes to the hall. And you know when you go to breakfasts and they give you the knife and the fork and it's all wrapped up, you know, the community breakfast? So Frankie does that. So he's got a job and he takes care of the knives and forks at the hall in Discouse. On Tuesday, he goes swimming with a whole group of them, and they go and he gets groceries. He goes to the gym on Wednesdays, he goes to the Rock on Thursdays, and he goes to Friday at L'Arche. And a note about L'Arche, like, this is how good his life, like, we are all doing the wrong gig here, because when I went to L'Arche to talk to them about, you know, could Frankie maybe spend some time there, they said, sure, like, why don't you come for a tour first? And it was a Friday. And I said, what time do you want? He said, just make sure you're here for coffee time, because everybody's together and you get to see everybody, and it's such a warm and friendly time. And I said, so I went and I'm talking to Mukhtar, the leader, community leader, and, you know, I'm looking at my watch and it's like, you know, 10 o'clock, 10:15, 10:20, and I'm in a bit of a panic. And I said, you know, Mukhtar, I know you wanted us to go and see the coffee break, you know, or do we need to rush? And he said, no, we've got time. It runs from 10 to 2. So if we are all in the wrong business, so Frankie goes to L'Arche on Friday, and coffee break is from 10 until 2. You'll need to talk to him before or after that. And so this is my last slide, and I know that it's warm in here, but I'm open to conversation. But what I want you to know is that Frankie is getting what's called flex funding through the Department of Community Services. It's this secret little program that's embedded in websites if you look far enough. But that flex funding is going to become, through the course of this year, individualized funding for every single person with a disability in the province of Nova Scotia, court-ordered, to the tune of $1 billion over the next 3 or 4 years. So when you think about your kids as they exit, what are some ways that they can have meaningful lives in their community if money is not an object? And what can programming, starting really early on, how can that help them move through the trajectory? So that is my little presentation about what it means to be inclusive in our time. And I think I've gone over a little bit, so I apologize for that. But I'm open to questions if anybody has any. I know you can only handle what your caffeine tolerance withdrawal allows, but. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll stick around. If anybody has any questions about anything, I'll stick around for coffee break if anybody has anything. I appreciate it. I know it's a little bit warm in here, so thank you very much. I'm really grateful.
We have a gift for our speaker. Don't go anywhere. Sit down. Pause it. If you need to stretch, I don't mean to be bossy, so.
And don't be afraid to tell him I just need to stand, I need a stretch break. I just wanted to share, we have a few gifts here for Lois. For anyone that knows Malige, where is she? She may have stepped out for a second. Malige, stand and take a bow for a second. If anyone has ever seen a Malige bag, this woman is gifted. Malige, these are handmade bags with Indigenous print fabric from Indigenous artisans across Canada. So thanks, Malige. And of course, everything is locally sourced and handmade.
Okay, some housekeeping items. First of all, is there any New York Yankee fans in the house? Son? Is there any Toronto Blue Jays fans in the house? Is there any Boston Red Sox fans in the house? So what do we all have in common? None of our teams won the World Series this year. That's inclusion. So first of all, I've been asked to mention that the students here at Lois School are selling 50-50 tickets today in the main lobby upstairs, so be sure to drop by and support them. And during the break, we have some information booths. Maui Dom will be here, or is here, and the Educational Leadership Consortium of Nova Scotia, and they have 5 $50 gas cards. And all you have to do is fill out their survey, and they have a QR code. So take a few minutes to fill out their survey at their booth. And of course, our special Indian Bison Snack Shack. Make sure you drop by and support Bison. So during the break, please take the opportunity to see those folks. And when you go to your panel sessions at 11 a.m., there is a cap in each room. So once the chairs are filled, you cannot enter. Find another one. So the overflow will be here. There'll be a session here in the gymnasium. So at lunchtime at 11:45, you'll grab your lunch in the cafeteria and have it here. Please do not come in here to disrupt the session at 11:45. It'll be done at 11:45. Do not come in prior to that. Because I know as Olu, we are not quiet eaters.